Welcome to Washington Policy on the Go. My name is David Bose. I'm the Communications and Marketing Director for Washington Policy Center. And this is the second week in a row, I think, we've done a Washington Policy on the Go. And the purpose for that is to get our calendar back in order. We had our annual dinner events, which kind of threw us off a week, which was throwing some of you off a week. So we're back to the every other week schedule after this. However, next week we will have a bonus episode because Todd Meyer's new book, Time to Think Small, which is being released today. There's a big launch event in Bellevue tonight. Todd's book is out, and we'll do a special feature on that book next week. So be on the lookout to sign up for that and be a part of that as well. Today we have a jam-packed episode. We have four of our center directors coming on to give brief updates. And as always with the new format, we just go. We will for sure stop by 1 o'clock sharp to respect your time. But we might not quite go up to that. We might end at 12:45, 12:30, depending. We're just going to go as far as the content requires. And also, if you have questions, be sure to ask them right away, because as soon as we're done with the content of one center director, we're moving on to the next. So use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and ask that question that you have of any of any of the center directors. I already have a request in to turn up the volume of my microphone, which means I can lean into it a little bit. So I apologize for that. All right, let's go to Pam Lewison first. She is our Agriculture Director. Pam, you have a column about the impact of L&I on agriculture. I guess there's some increases on the way. Why is that? Why is that increase? Why is there something unique to agriculture in that increase, and what our farmers and ranchers and other agricultural employers and workers, what should they expect?
So last week, Elle and I had a comment period open to talk about workers' comp, and their announcement was that for most folks, the workers' comp rate would increase 4.8%, which works out to be about $61 an employee. For ag, however, the average rate increase is 6% and potentially all the way up to 14% if you're a vineyard worker. That's a pretty significant increase for next year when you consider that we just had a rate increase this year. And when you start doing the math for some of that, if you're looking at our orchard workers, which are most folks, what we're talking about here is $31 a paycheck on the worker side and $123 a paycheck for employers. So there's a pretty significant increase that comes with this workers' comp. What's interesting about Washington is we're one of only 4 states that require employers and employees to pay into the state workers' comp system. So you can have ancillary workers' comp benefits through a private policy, but you are also required to pay into the state sort of monopoly through workers' comp. And that gives, our state L&I sort of this ability to charge whatever they want and increase the rates whenever they want, despite ag in particular in Washington being among the safest states for any employee.
So the rates for workers' compensation are going to go up whether you're a safe employer or not. I mean, usually, with my car insurance, the longer I'm a safe driver, the more my rates go down, right? So this is operating differently for ag employer. Well, I guess all employers, but particularly ag employers.
Yeah, all employers, but I think what's interesting about it in ag in particular is that we have historical data that says ag employers in Washington over the last several years have ranked in the top 5 states in terms of employee safety, which makes it much different than some of the other states, and yet ag producers are still going to have to suffer this 6% increase or more based on what your employees, what their job description is effectively.
I'll probably ask this of Elizabeth as well, but what's the holdup on, I think for a lot of people, it would surprise them to know that Washington is just one of four to have that kind of monopoly, and that there's private insurance markets for unemployment. Because, for as long as I can remember, Washington is just, there's L&I, and, it's part of the lingo. Everybody knows it, and it's just part of government. So, why is it that the other, 46 states can handle having competition there, but Washington cannot?
Actually 45. Texas doesn't require you to have any kind of unemployment or workers' comp insurance if you don't want it.
Leave it to Texas.
Yeah, of course. So I think it really comes down to the state wanting to make sure that they're sort of getting their cut, as we see so often in government programs. But I think that when you look at these year-over-year percentage increases, particularly when you're talking about a time frame when we see grocery prices increasing 13% this year, and other, fuel prices going up and those sorts of things. Certainly, if there was ever a year to not take more money out of people's paychecks, I think this is the year to have that not occur. And certainly, I think it's something we should be talking about, whether or not L&I is really the best place for people to be getting their workers' comp insurance.
How big of a problem is this for the agricultural sector in Washington? I mean, when we hear about these, what's even the big raises in the tax, many of them are single digits. What does it mean for an ag employer, and also the employee too? Because as you point out, if somebody's taking $116 for every paycheck, and 16 directly out of that you're going to see on your paycheck, taken out, but your employer has to pay that 116. Odds are that 116, that's money that could have gone to you on the get-go, but it's not, because they're paying more. And
I think in ag in particular, what you have to consider is it's something that's piling on. We have started the ag overtime rate change here. So once you hit 55 hours this year as an employer, you have to pay your employees a time and a half. So you have additional costs there. Plus you're looking at, next year that'll be dropped down to 48 hours. You have additional minimum wage costs. If you're an H-2A employer, you are paying an AWAR that goes up an average of anywhere from 2 to 6% a year. You have, and then you have this L&I cost on top of it. So it just piles on, increase over increase. And what people forget is on the food production side, direct ag production doesn't get to pass that cost on. So if you're if you're in a grocery store setting or a food processing setting, you have the potential to just increase your cost to your buyer. But if you are on farm, you don't get to increase the cost of your contract to offset these other costs that you have.
Because you're making the contracts well in advance. Is that what you're saying?
Not only are you making the contract well in advance, it's always a buyer's market, not a seller's market.
I'd like to see these things put on the paycheck, like if you're getting $16 taken out, but it's really, 130, it'd be better to have that amount at least on your paycheck, so you could see what your employer is paying you. And I think that's an important thing for people to realize, that does impact them. Otherwise, people kind of shrug it off and think, well, an employer's paying something, and they don't make that personal connection.
I think anybody who's curious really should ask their employer what their job code is for their workers' comp and for L&I. You can look it up. So you can see exactly how much your employer is paying and what you are paying per paycheck for L&I, both now and in the future, because all of these rates are listed and they're public information.
I feel like Pam's trying to get you fired, like walking up to an employer and just saying, yeah, I wanted to ask, what's the deal with L&I? It just sounds like I've got a scam cooking. And,
Well, I don't think that any change is going to occur unless it comes from the workers.
That's right.
The workers say, hey, I'd rather have you give me that $130 and I'll find insurance for myself.
Yeah, no doubt. And I appreciate your time. I know you've got some other items to attend to today, but I appreciate the update on that. And it's kind of shocking because you can go back through WPC material back. I went back through from about 2001 to now, and it's just over and over again. It's LNI's raising rates, even though they don't have to, they shouldn't have to. LNI is just, the rates are going up. And giving themselves credit for moving them up less than they expected to, but it's just piling on those rates and keeping the political advantage of holding that monopoly to the detriment of the employers and the employees. Appreciate the time, Pam.
Thanks, Dave.
You bet. So you can check out her blog at washingtonpolicy.org to learn more. Let's go to Elizabeth Hovde. She is the director for our Center for Worker Rights and our Center for Healthcare, wearing two hats these days. Not two faces, just two hats. So Elizabeth, with real quick on the LNI situation, I know you've been watching that issue. Why do you think Washington maintains this monopoly when you've got basically all but 4 states ready to allow for some form of competition, and yet Washington kind of stands by itself saying, no, even though its history is dramatic increases in costs that are more than inflation should warrant, and this is pre-modern the current inflation trend. Washington's just held firm to this monopoly model. Why do you think that is?
Washington thinks it knows better, right? We're seeing this all across the board. You've got it with L&I, workers' comp. You've got it with long-term care now. You have it with Paid Family Leave Act. I think the state really believes it can do better at saving your money than you can, and that it can allocate it in a way they see fit.
Well, today's the day that the emergency powers clock on Washington Policy Center should be stopping. It's at 975 days. The emergency is finally over. And it's interesting to me how several executives, but Governor Inslee most prominently here, have been able to predict when an emergency is going to end. Like they'll say, well, this emergency is going to end, in 3 weeks, which is kind of strange to me because it makes me think it's less of an emergency if you're not mired in an emergency if you could say exactly when it ends, right? I mean,
inflation is an emergency. I'm telling you that.
Yeah, well, now that's closer to it, but it's a different kind of emergency. Although with our current system, maybe they could declare what they want. But with that declaration, some things have remained the same, including some of the mandates. What about the booster mandates for state employees? We've had a series of incidents where there's been a drought of employees for example, the ferry system, for snow plowing, which is coming up again. And for some other state positions, do the folks that had exemptions from the vaccine, can they come back without getting the vaccine? And where does the governor stand on his mandates and the booster mandate?
Well, it all depends, right? So the booster inclusive vaccine mandate was negotiated away in the summer, and instead a $1,000 incentive would be paid to people who agreed to get an updated vaccination via booster. So that was negotiated away in 2023. If people show that they have a booster that's up to date at the time, 2023, they will get the money. There is large disapproval for this in our state. Only 27% approve of the governor giving these booster incentives away. 35% of us in this media university poll said there shouldn't be a requirement or an incentive, but this is where it's going. Now, the emergency ended, but the mandate still exists for most state agencies. So there's some firefighters, it's off of emergency responders and educators, but it's still in force for state agencies. And they have, the governor also issued a directive that said there would be no new hires that are not vaccinated.
I just saw a court case, I think it was out of New York, where New York was paying through the nose for the people that they fired. They had to pay them back wages. They had to rehire them. it's like that football coach out here, there's only so long they could not rehire the people. The court said, no, you got to rehire them. And they were getting a big payoff because they were mistreated. Washington could end up, in a similar position here. I think with some of particularly some of the exemptions we've written about it on the WPC page, where particularly religious exemptions that seem to be ignored on a widespread basis. Is there any movement, any changes in the state tone based on what happened in New York and the possibility of court challenges?
I haven't seen
of?
I haven't seen a change in the tone. I know that the New York Supreme Court decision to order New York City to offer rehire to those workers and give them back pay. I know that's given energy to mistreated workers all around the nation, right? And I do know there's pockets of employees everywhere thinking about suing their government or going after their government for how they were treated during this emergency. But remember that the state of emergency vaccine mandate is not the same as what we have now. We have a governor who has issued a directive that says this is a new employment standard for state agencies. So it is not the same situation as New York is in, and we'll have to see how this plays out.
Yeah, it reminds me of certain circumstances where, like, foster parents were in short supply. You've got I think there's thousands of kids that are in need of foster parents, and yet you add on various hurdles for people, and then there's this shock that they're not, attracting more people into foster care, which is always kind of strange.
Yeah.
You pointed out in one blog about the booster bribe negotiated here, and the polling on that. Go through that a little bit in terms of how much is the bribe that the governors negotiated, and I use bribe loosely. It's a great figurative tool or term, but really, when you just take a step back and think about, is this booster mandate, if it's supposed to be helpful, you don't have to pay people to do it. Some of the people getting the money have already had that booster, so obviously you're not encouraging them. This is not an incentive to get a booster. It's basically a flat out, it's an excuse to give an extra bit of cash to people without putting it on their wages. And that way you're able to avoid, what the true increase in the overall package is in some ways. At least that's my view.
Well, this thing has rocked and rolled, right? So the booster mandate, as I understand it, and as the Office of Financial Management has confirmed for me, it will be something you still have to get. It is something that you have to be update with recommendations in 2023. So whatever booster is recommended at that time, your past booster might not have gotten you the money. You have to, in 2023, show that you are up to date with all CDC recommendations for vaccination and boosting to get the money. So that's one nuance to this thing. It's going to happen in 2023. It's not if you're boosted now. You got to keep getting the boosters. You got to keep updating to get the money. So that's one interesting aspect of it.
Any other hits on?
I forgot what else you asked.
No, it's okay. I just wondered if, there was a poll that you referenced that where people were not happy about this. And can you just give us a sentence or two on that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to note that there were people who thought boosters should still be a requirement, right? And I find them to be more consistent with public health imperatives than people who would just go for an incentive, which includes the governor. So we're giving these incentives. It's not bringing a health benefit, clearly, because you don't have to have it. And even if you did have to have it, King County numbers are showing right now that even being boosted isn't keeping you from getting sick. It's not keeping you out of the hospital. It's not keeping you from dying, if you believe those numbers. So there's not a demonstrable health benefit to Inslee's vaccine mandate or his booster idea. And instead, we're seeing individual lives ruined, family budgets altered. We're seeing state services go down, like you mentioned, the ferries, the snowplows. It's just not helping the state at all, and he doesn't retreat from it, and I'm not understanding why.
That's what bugs me the most. It's not, the booster itself so much as it is you're
Right.
destroying people's livelihoods and jobs, and the stress and emotional harm that does to people and their families and their children, because of something that's, what strikes me of dubious broader benefit. You might disagree with their decision. It might even be harmful to them personally. But as far as it being more harmful to everybody else, I'm not seeing that. I think
And I think it's super
problem.
important that people realize you can be anti-vaccine mandate and for vaccines. They're not one and the same,
Right.
Vaccines are showing, fully vaccinated people are showing to get sick less often, go to the hospital less, and die less than people who are not fully vaccinated or doing better than unvaccinated. Booster or not, it's still debatable. But in any case, you can be anti-vaccine mandate. This is a mandate on working age people. They're not the people by and large dying from this disease. And you can contract or spread whether you've been vaccinated or not. So it's just really important to recognize the difference of being against a mandate for a vaccine for work, and not feeling like you're falling into a camp where you're against these vaccines.
Yeah, well, as always, I appreciate your time. I do want to ask you real briefly if you have any updates on the long-term care tax, or long-term care program / payroll tax, so-called Washington Cares, because I know that there's been, some new figures, some new actuarial tables supposedly showing that the program is in the black, so to speak.
Yeah.
Give us a quick update on that.
Well, that's interesting. There was an actuarial study that was just done to update the earlier one that was done that showed that this program was insolvent before it even started. Now it's showing it just squeaks by at the current tax rate. And it's surprising to me because for a year plus, we've heard lawmakers and supporters and agency heads say that we really needed a higher tax rate or a lower benefit to make this thing solvent in the long run, or to have that constitutional amendment that would allow for extra types of investment to be involved in these funds. So I'm still reading the report, and at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if it's solventish now, if things work out in a certain way, or if it's not. According to the last actuarial study, the bottom line is that workers should not be penalized for working. And you don't take, it all adds up. It all goes back to that workers' compensation conversation. It all adds up. There's a paid family medical leave increase from 0.4% when it began to 0.8% in January. And I fear that the pattern with payroll taxes will prove true also for long-term care, even if an actuarial study shows it's solvent, which is good news for the people left in the program, that they'll end up maybe getting some money out of this thing. But the pattern with payroll taxes is that they go up and up and up. They don't pay their own way.
I'm also wondering how many payroll taxes can we have in this state? It seems like there's a lot of excitement about creating new things, and then you slap a payroll tax on it, and then you get a third party to pay for part of it, and congratulate yourself politically for the headlines that you got, providing something that you have a third party paying for, and eventually that stuff really adds up. It's like property taxes. You're paying a few extra cents here and a few extra bucks there per $100,000 of value, and then all of a sudden you're paying real money.
Exactly.
My property taxes went through the roof this year, and quite painfully. And so I'm well aware of these small incremental, just like life is lived in the moments your wallet leaves in little bits and pieces.
In July, just between paid family medical leave and Washington Cares, the long-term care program, you'll be paying $1.38 per $100 that you make. I haven't added workers' comp into that yet, and it varies based on industry, but it all adds up.
Mercier just typed in the chat that the number of payroll taxes is possible is to infinity and beyond. showing both his love of Disney and his astute observation of Washington state government.
I'm calling it lately social program via payroll tax, instead of the state budgeting well with our money, all of us, all of our taxes, they are penalizing workers, one payroll tax after another.
Yeah, and eventually you reach a tipping point where it becomes a much bigger problem. Appreciate what you've done there, Elizabeth. We'll continue to watch for that. I will say we'll go to Liv Finne next, but first I just wanted to add, I always bring up this show, Yes, Prime Minister, I Can't Help Myself. It's just one of the greatest political comedies and social commentaries, I think, of all time. And there's one episode where they go through a study and somebody says, well, we can't possibly do that because look at the study. It showed that this isn't going to work. And the civil servants say, no, we just need to create a new study with new assumptions, new numbers, and we'll get it. This time we're going to get it to say what we want. And that's what they do. And so they're able to show, hey, lo and behold, this program is wonderful. We just changed the way we calculate certain things, changed the definition of a few terms, and now the public's on the hook for it. So you can learn so much. And that's why I'm calling me a cynic, but I'm skeptical of new reports, especially after a politically desired program comes out and a report says it's not feasible. And then they wait for a while or quiet and a new report comes out saying, lo and behold, everything is fine. I personally tend not to trust the new results that much. Liv Finne is with us now. And speaking of results, we have some new results for student testing in Washington state and beyond. Liv, the NAEP test results are out. I take it Washington's still right there and hovering near the top in terms of learning and achievement in math and reading and all positive things.
Not so. The policy to close the schools down for nearly 2 years has now shown itself to have harmed and fallen hardest on the children of Washington state. It's discouraging to see. The NAEP test is the nation's report card. It's considered a gold standard of testing. It's given every 2 years to 4th graders and 8th graders in the topics of math, reading, and science. And the 2022 results were out a couple months ago, but recently broken down by state, and that's why we can now say that Washington is basically in the middle of the pack, slightly at average, below average. Now on all these test scores, it's a very serious matter because until now, Washington has been in the top dozen states when you start comparing across the nation. But what I think is really concerning is on Friday, that is 4 days after the state level results were released, the Harvard School of Education, led by Professor Thomas Kane and a Stanford professor, broke down these numbers and showed what it actually means in terms of the student level, in terms of the individual. And they showed, and the Center Square has a good article about it, describing saying many Washington youths have lost almost a year of math instruction as a result of these school closures. And in Seattle Public Schools, it's about 5 months of loss of math. And what really alarmed me, Dave, was that this Professor Kane said that his concern is that 90% of parents think that everything is all right, that there's nothing to see here. And so I was thinking about that and where that's coming from. And then I look on Facebook and I see from a trusted friend that the school districts are telling parents that don't worry about the COVID school shutdowns, we'll catch your kids up. And so there we go. We're here dealing with a misinformation campaign by the schools themselves, using their trusted positions as teachers of the children, telling parents that the children are not behind. And that really alarmed me, okay? Because we can catch the kids up, but if the society doesn't think that these scores mean anything, if there's no pressure put upon the districts to provide the individual tutoring that the kids need, then it'll all go away. That's why the professor was saying this. This is very important. We need to proclaim from the tops of every hill, for every mayor should be calling for something to be done about this. Well, so I guess I don't know what to say except to say that we really truly need to put the money in the hands of the parents so they can catch their kids up. And every parent and grandparent out there should be seeking to, to have their kid evaluated. Where is your particular child that you love in math and reading? And then take action yourself, because you can't rely on the public schools to do this. Having lost a year or 5 months of math is going to devastate their progress, especially in math. That this will repeat. Next year, we're going to, the next 2 years, we're going to see the same scores. The kids will get further and further behind. It is a catastrophe. And the public schools are doing their best to cover it up, essentially.
Now, and it's funny, I'm not even, there's been a long pattern, and I think you've written about this before, where people assume that their local public school is doing a great job, even if it's average or below average. There's just this assumption, and part of that's what you say. There's always rosy materials coming out. I can't tell you how many calls I got from and emails from the Tacoma district, extolling the virtues of, I think it's a new parks levy or something. And there's always this positive messaging coming around, and usually you have interaction with people and you tend to like them. So, you're not going to judge them poorly. But the data is not going to lie. I mean, either kids are learning there or they're not. And it seems like Superintendent Reichdahl, it was a few months ago where there was a controversy between what he said to the state ed board and your blog about what he said. It was caught on video. He certainly said it. His public relations folks said he did not, but we showed the video and it was very clear. He didn't think Washington State testing really mattered that much. But he did appear on the Dory Monson show on Cairo 97.3, and he said that this test, the one we're talking about now this one is the one that matters. Yes. And now you're pointing out we've dropped down to the middle. So has there been any public acknowledgement from the top, from Reichdahl about, hey, okay, I was wrong. This is a big deal. We're going to have to deal with it.
He is conspicuously absent from making any statement about the NAEP scores because he knows full well this is very serious. And your description of what happened on the Dory Monson show is spot on, Dave. I mean, a couple months ago when Dory Monson had Reichdahl on his show, and Dory asked him, what about these state test scores showing that 70% of the kids in Washington State failed the state test in math? What about those scores? And Superintendent Reichdahl said, oh, our test scores, those are not important. I mean, that itself is questionable. Here he is. This is the test that he has put in place to test the kids in the state, and he dismisses that test as being meaningful. He says,
and we have members on there, right? We have members on the board of that testing that we help create the test so that it's meaningful, and we spend a bunch of money on it. And then he's publicly saying, this old thing, don't even listen to that.
He's one of the leaders on that Smarter Balanced Assessment Coalition consortium. Yeah. And they pushed it. This is going to be the best thing since sliced bread several years back. Remember? So now all of a sudden those bad scores on that test, those don't mean anything. The NAEP scores, that's what really means something. And those NAEP scores until now have shown that Washington State is in the leading group of states doing above average. Now, no longer, that is not the case. On the 2022 scores, the 4th and 8th graders tested the lowest ever since the administration of the test. Like, we just kind of dropped out of there. And so he's not saying a thing about it. And so that should tell everybody everything they need to know.
I want to answer a quick question here from John. He wanted to know where he could download the education report. And your blog has that kind of information linked up to it. I know that right there. So he can do it. Yeah, he can do it there. You can just go to WashingtonPolicy.org, check out Liv's blog. Their research center directors are great at linking these reports in so that they can do that. Yeah.
Yes, and you can also just Google NAEP, at National Assessment of Educational Progress, NAEP, and that is a website that's maintained by the Department of Education in Washington, D.C., and you can get to state level numbers and see all the breakdown there. And the other place to go is the OSPI website, which has the school report card, which gives those Smarter Balanced tests across the state and by district, by the way. So that's helpful. That gets you more decentralized data. but there's nothing like knowing what your individual kid, where he or she is, and ask your teachers for that information. And that they have it. They have it.
Yeah. So another question from John was that how do we accomplish 1 or 2 years of non-learning in 1 or maybe 2 years moving forward? So what if they can catch kids up an extra year, how would they go about doing that? Do they have a special plan? Otherwise, it does make you wonder if you could do that before, if you could do all that learning in 2 years, according to the current schedule, then, you wouldn't really need a junior and senior year of high school, right?
Well,
You could just,
I know these things are all very mushy, but of course, the thing is that there's just not an apples to apples comparison. The children did get some remote learning. Some of that was effective. A lot of it wasn't. Basically now with these new test scores, the Harvard and Stanford statisticians can break it out and show how much was actually lost. Okay. So about a year or half a year, whatever district you're in is what was lost. And so these averages are not really useful to the individual parent or grandparent. That's why I say get a hold of the actual score for the child, and then you will find out, and take it to an independent consultant maybe, or some teacher you trust within the system. What does this mean? Where is my child at in this subject? And where should they be at? And how can we get them there? And like all the researchers across the country, this Professor Thomas Cade said, what is needed most is to provide individual tutoring for every child. Now, that seems like a huge undertaking. It's not such a huge undertaking, but the reason for that is because you have to determine whether the child is behind or not. Some children, a lot of children basically teach themselves. But a lot of children need a lot of guidance. So you need individual, you need to look at the child and then move from there. And that's why individual tutoring is necessary. You evaluate where the child is and then move them ahead to catch them up. And kids can get caught up really fast because the schools move, extremely slowly through the curriculum, as and they circle back across it. So if we take measures now, the children can get caught up, and they in these steps that they need to make in development, they need to make to get to, high school level math. But if we let it go, and do nothing, which is what apparently the state of Washington intends to do, the state superintendent intends to do nothing, then many children, particularly kids of low-income backgrounds, whose parents or parents who are not paying attention, not just low-income parents who are not paying attention, are going to fall behind, and families are going to find this out when they fail to graduate from high school or when they drop out of college.
Danny Westnate wrote a really interesting column about a guy who took it upon himself. I think it was a venture capitalist of some kind, software guy. He just decided, I've got some spare time here. I'm going to cure the math problem in North Seattle, and he just went to work helping kids catch up. And you blogged about this, Liv, where he had pretty dramatic results really fast, and it was not. A lot of times when we've talked about education scholarship accounts or something, and in some places they've been looking for, a couple $1,000s or a few $1,000s, and people say, well, you can't do anything with that. Well, this guy's doing huge gains in math for $500 per kid, or 500 to 1,000. Huge gains.
Yes.
So, it was really, it's like, I know the results are really early, and, it's a small sample size and the rest, but holy smokes, it looks like, sometimes a small amount of money can make a huge difference, unless you're just funding the system and not the child. In this case, you've got exactly what you alluded to. They're catering to the child as an individual rather than as a systemic block. So,
well, that's exactly right. This physics professor who targeted a group of students in Northgate Elementary who are in the category of child expected to fail these tests, low-income kids, and he brought, you'd expect 11% of them to pass the state test. Instead, he moved them up to 60% of them to pass the test with a little bit of, twice a week tutoring after school from UW students. So if we all pitched in, as a society, retired people, students in college, helping out these kids catch up, this could really be done. And of course, you need leadership to do something like that, don't you, Dave? You need someone standing on the rooftop and yelling and screaming, we need to do this. The state of Washington has $1.6 billion in unspent COVID relief funds. And I divided, it's just not hard to divide $1 million into 1.6 billion. That's $1,600 per student in Washington state. There's 1 million students. $1.6 billion, that's $1,600 per student. That would get you an evaluation by a outside consultant. Where is your child? And at least a start towards catching them up, and maybe a roadmap. I have to tell you something. That prime minister story you tell about, those reports that you referred to after talking to Elizabeth is so excellent. You know what happens in public education? This is what's happening now. They're writing their strategic plans and they're making rosy promises. Oh yes, if they in fact acknowledge the loss of learning from the COVID school shutdowns shown on these NAEP tests, if in fact they will do that, they will then write a new strategic plan. They'll say, in 5 years, we will get there. And this is what I've seen over and over again. It's so discouraging. I mean, they project out into the future and they promise everybody it's going to be fine, it's going to be fine. And then no one ever holds them accountable for failing to meet the promises that they made at the time.
Well, you certainly solved the problem in terms of, you've got a bunch of kids that are behind because of what you did previously. If you can wait 5 years, most of them, at least in the upper grades, a lot of them will be out of the system altogether.
Yes.
So they're no
Yes.
longer your problem. They're the problem
Yes.
of prisons,
Yes.
unemployment agencies, other things, and they're wondering why they're struggling to get a job, or maybe their problem is student debt from going to a college that was way too expensive for what it was they're studying. But but they're outside of the public school problem. And so that's the
Right.
problem with waiting, with problem with the system that doesn't follow this. If the system is dedicated to the system and not the kid, it's really easy to fail the child, because bureaucracies move slow. And,
Oh,
unless you have parents directing that money. That's why I love your education savings accounts plan, the video we have up at fundstudentsfirst.com. I'd urge people to share it. Hey, there's over 50 people watching right now. If all 50 of them shared it, that'd be a big deal. Maybe catch a bandwagon, but I know that this is the reality. Even passionate people, they don't act except for a fraction of the time. It's a strange thing. But I think COVID kind of awakened something within parents, the shutdowns of schools, the frustrations that they've seen. So I hold out more hope now for educational reform than I ever have, I think, in my other than when I was in my teens and early 20s and was idealistic. I thought, well, it just makes sense. Why wouldn't you? You can choose everything else. So
I agree, Dave.
Yeah.
I so agree. When I had kids in school and I went to push for change at the principal level or this teacher level or whatever, and I got this, we'll just wait. I could tell they were, we'll just wait her out. And I remember going home and looking up the term that describes. It's called temporizing. They wait you out until you're gone, and then they don't have to deal with you anymore. The unhappy parent. Now, if I had the money that they were using to, that the taxpayers provide to educate my child, and if I could have taken it with me at the time, if I could have said to that principal, look, if you don't give me a good teacher to educate my child with, I'm taking that money and I'm leaving your school, they would be much more responsive. And that is the whole promise of this idea. But besides the fact that giving the money to parents allows the people who really care about the child to do something to educate the child. So that's of course primary, giving parents power to decide. But the secondary benefit is that the traditional public schools, the research is showing that. There are many studies coming out showing that when you have a market, enough people leaving with their money to a private delivery system, the public system sits up and takes notice and says, we're going to do better, because they don't want their money to leave. And it's just all understanding incentives here. It's about money always.
Yeah, it's a frustrating thing to watch, and it's sad to watch, especially, I always think back to your stat, with the 41,000 students in Washington State at self-identified failing schools. And then, over the years, they stopped calling them failing schools, started calling them like schools that need added assistance. And then it was something like, schools that need better success, and they just modified. as though changing
Supports.
what you call it, right?
Yeah, supports, schools in
Right.
need of support.
Right, so and then, but in the meantime, each one of those years represents a new grade level that's gone, right? They're no longer a problem, they're gone, and yet the system remains. So again, let's fund students, not the system. That's the key. Fundstudentsfirst.com. You can check out Liv's big video there and hopefully share it. And there's lots of follow-through information there as well as part of our solutions on the table. Liv, thanks so much for the time. We're going to jump over to Jason there. Liv, watch for a lot. There's a lot of questions on there that I'm going to have you type into these folks, the ones that you can answer there
Okay,
on
great.
the Q&A page there.
I'll do so with pleasure. Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. All right, Jason, the emergency is finally over. You've been following the Emergency Powers Act. The emergency in Washington State is finally over at day 975. Nice of him to choose that nice, easy to remember number. I was kind of, at that point, I thought, why not go for 1,000? But maybe that was just too much, too symbolic. So we got 975 days of emergency. How does this change the way government works in Washington State now that the 3-year emergency is over? How did it change Washington's governance, and and what are we looking at now?
Yeah, Dave, these last 24 hours have been a total roller coaster of emotions, right? Last night we were out trick-or-treating with our kids. This past week I was going to my daughter's theater production, having her friends over. And when you're doing all of this, it's kind of easy to forget, as a human coping mechanism, as we try to forget traumatic events. And then I spent this morning going through 975 days of Governor Inslee's press releases, and it all came flooding back. The panic phone calls from businesses, am I able to open my doors? The panic emails from parents saying, what's happening with my child's education? They're falling behind. And what I think is the most frustrating thing about all of this, it has nothing to do with Governor Inslee. It almost has nothing to do with the actual orders he's imposed. It has to do with a fundamental issue that we are guaranteed a Republican form of government, right? Separation. Small r.
Right.
Republican form of government where the legislative branch sets policy. We did not sign up for a benevolent monarchy, no matter how wise and benevolent the decisions are made from one person behind closed doors. But that is the structure of Washington's emergency powers. It's not a personality thing. It's not about COVID. It's not about Inslee. It's not about mandates. It's about the fact that our emergency power statute is probably the worst in the country because there is almost no legislative oversight. So while we celebrate today that the governor has finally 975 days later decided to return for now to normal governance, nothing has changed. That statute remains in effect, and the need for reform is just as strong as it was today as it was 976 days ago.
That's the part that surprised me the most about the whole thing is, I certainly understand why governors have emergency authority. A hurricane hits, they got to move things right away because there's all kinds of actual emergencies taking place. And those tend to be of short duration. And pretty soon the legislative authority kicks back in. It's while you're dealing with things when it's difficult for the legislature to meet, where you have to address. But when in this case, at about 6 months in, even 3 months in, I just kept thinking, wait a second, what happened to the legislature? I thought that there used to be a feeling of separation of powers and authority and respect that came from those positions where there would have been a jealousness to protect the powers of each branch of government and each house in the legislature. And for the majority leadership, you didn't see this at all for the past 3 years. They've been very content to say, well, we're out of these policy decisions. The governor's setting the decisions we like, so it's not important for us to be at the table anymore. And it made me think of, there's been some rumors of, the governor not treating legislators very well, not respecting them at the table or negotiating. And I thought, well, why would he, since you're basically surrendering this authority, voluntarily? He's just illustrating the point that he was right to begin with, that you don't seem all that interested in asserting yourself, and your position, more importantly than yourself, your position's authority for the future.
Yeah, I mean, the lack of interest in legislating and being a lawmaker in Washington from the majority party, I think, is the the most dumbfounding part of this 2.5+ years. I mean, to be honest with you, if I could do it over again, I probably would have moved, because never in my wildest dreams did I think our legislators would be unique in the fact that they didn't think they had a role, right? It didn't matter. Let's go to the other Democratic trifecta states where you have a Democratic governor and a Democratic legislature. Hawaii, California, New York, New Mexico. What happened in those states? You had orders, you had governors doing the same thing. I mean, even the governors of Idaho and Texas and Florida did these things. But in those other states, there either was a requirement to go back to the legislature for ratification. Yes, governor, you're making the correct decision, and we believe that's the right policy. Or in Hawaii, in New York, in New Mexico, you saw efforts from Democratic legislators saying, we appreciate your intent, governor, but we are the legislative branch of government and we have a role in this. And they fought to plant that flag saying, don't forget us, the legislative branch of government. We should be involved in this. That just did not happen in Washington. It's the most surprising thing, because the reality is you probably would have seen the legislature approve some of this, but it would have happened the way it's supposed to happen, where you are having a public open process. And I think that what my biggest concern is now going forward, the order have ended. We have a return to normalcy, but that statute remains in effect. And if we don't change anything, don't be surprised to see us go through this again, because it's easy to do. Why would I want to have to go to 147 other lawmakers to get permission for something that I think is the best thing ever as a governor, right? You're not going to do that. And until we restore that balance of power, we're at risk of this again.
Not only easy to do it, why wouldn't you do it? As governor, I mean, you're basically, the lack of action is consent from the majority there. I mean, I will say the minority party did make a move, toward they said that they wanted change, but in our system, the minority can howl, but that's it. I'm also surprised, by the way, of the media for the most part. I know it's not a popular thing. Media tends to not like criticism, but I expected more pressure on the governor to get us out of the emergency earlier, to return to legislative authority. Just, for the past, I don't know how long now, I feel like I've heard that we're protecting democracy here in the media by reporting on things. And here is a situation where, that form of government is being abused. Now it's legally abused. I'm not accusing the governor of doing something illegal there, but I'm saying it's clearly an abuse of what is intended by that power. And you have, large swaths of the political leadership going along with it. And as you point out, it's not even a policy change, it's a process change, because, democracy matters. Even in districts where that one side is going to win because they get 75% of the vote. Remember, Jim McDermott used to get like 74% of the vote on a bad run when he was running for Congress. You still hold an election so that people have that choice, right? You don't just say, well, let's not even bother this year. We'll save some money on the ballots. But in this case, we just kind of decided, well, governor's doing the kinds of things we like. Therefore, we don't need the legislative process there. And I think that's a wrong way for Washington to head, and a bad precedent for future governors.
Let's come back to that legal in just a second, because there's a development on that. But all we're asking for is really simple, right? When you look at Washington's emergency power statute, it says if the governor waives a law or suspends a law, that action expires after 30 days unless the legislature approves it, right? So you've probably heard the governor say, I don't know what the concern is. The legislature's approved dozens of my orders. Right. That's partially true, because that was when you waived or suspended a law, and that required legislative sign off. Where our law falls apart, and it is totally illogical, I can't understand why this distinction is made. But if the governor issues a restriction on an individual or on a business, the mandates, that requires no timeline to be suspended. That requires no legislative oversight and can continue indefinitely. That's what we experienced, right? When he waived a statute or law, the legislature was involved. When he imposed restrictions, he closed the schools, he closed the businesses. He told you can't have people from outside your house. You have to quarantine for 2 weeks when you come back into the state, right? All of these things, the legislature had no role in that. And there's just no reason to make that distinction. The governor has to make the case to the legislature if he's going to suspend a law, right? He has to say, well, this is why I'm doing it. He should have to do the same thing if he's going to impose restrictions on citizens.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. It's, you know, the legislature there, and one of their big jobs is to protect your rights as a citizen, you know, at least in theory. So,
But that's where we get back to this new legal development, because, you know, there obviously were dozens and dozens of lawsuits filed, but they attacked Inslee as an individual and they went after the mandates. And whether you like it or not, the authority for health mandates goes back to the 1800s. The U.S. Supreme Court has ratified that. So that's why those cases fail. There is a new angle on this, though, and actually the state Supreme Court on February 23rd of next year is going to hear oral arguments in this case. And it's looking at more of the base authority of these emergency powers. Like, is the legislature able constitutionally to delegate its authority on laws to the governor? That's a really interesting constitutional question.
Yeah.
We also have very strong contract protections in our Constitution. You cannot impair a contract. And if you were a landlord, what happened to your contracts for 2 years? They basically didn't exist, right? So the Supreme Court has actually accepted this case, and it's a really interesting constitutional challenge. We'll have to see what they do with it.
Really interesting. Look forward to that, Jason. As always, I want to thank everybody for attending. I want to encourage you, go to solutionsonThetable.com, solutionsonThetable.com. Check out our latest videos there. We've got socially shareable topics and assets that you can share on social media that really highlight some key Washington Policy Center positions, you know, like cutting the sales tax, like repealing the 46 cent per gallon gas or tax on gas impact that's going to happen in 2023, projected increase, I should say. That's part of the emissions tax issue. So you can go to solutionsonThetable.com. You can check those out. I would encourage you to share that with your friends as well. Next week, we'll do a special episode. I'm not sure it'll be Tuesday. It might be a different day of the week, but watch for an invite for a conversation with Todd Myers about his new book, Time to Think Small, where he challenges the environmental establishment and points out that empowering individuals and new technologies are achieving things that government mandates and really expensive programs are only promising to do and failing to do so efficiently. So you can check that out. It's available wherever books are sold, prominently on Amazon, of course. And you can learn more about his book on our website, WashingtonPolicy.org. He has a big book launch tonight in Bellevue. So if you're looking for something fun to do tonight, by all means, go to the events page at WashingtonPolicy.org and be a part of that as well. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you in 2 weeks for Washington Policy on the Go.